Okay, so we are going to do a little experiment, hashtag third line life. I kind of got inspired with everything happening in the world and wanted to provide some astrological and human design context together about what I'm seeing happening right now. I pulled these charts on June 9th, so there you go, but it is 12:17 a.m. on June 10th, so whatever, here we go. So this is the transit human design chart for, I think it was like 9 p.m., a little before 9 p.m. on Monday, June 9th. And I want to point out, even though there's not specific like channels together, but there's some really interesting pairs and gate keynotes that I want to point out. So I've just kind of pulled the selected themes and that I think are relevant to now. Any of these things are very prismatic. You can look at them from the language of the I Ching and the many interpretations or commentaries on that ancient volume, because the gates are the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching. You can look at it through gene keys. I'm pulling stuff from kind of the human design interpretations. So just note that there. So the sun is in gate 45 and 45.3 when I pull this chart, which I'm going to ignore the line level for now since that's going to shift over time. But gate 45 is the gate of the gatherer, but it is also like the king or the gate of control. It's the person who wants to keep things tight and in control and have a say in the way things go. And it's like my way or the highway. So that's really interesting, is this like major sun energy that is filtering in right now. It's one of the gates of the throat, I believe, with phrases I have. So that's obviously interesting for what we're talking about going on in LA specifically, as well as even Israel with controlling resources. Then we have the earth in the gate of the salesperson. And I pulled that keynote because gate 26 is really about what story are you telling, or what information are you including or omitting, which I think is really interesting with what is happening with different images that are going around online, what's happening with news on social media versus news, and like even on like Substack versus like the corporate news or mainstream news, whatever you want to call that these days. So I think that's really interesting because it has this potential for like selective memory or selective storytelling. Then we have the gate of the next pair that's really interesting. The sun and the earth are opposites on the mandala in human design or even the I Ching. And then we have the next pair, it's also opposite. So we have the north node, which is, I think, currently in Pisces, and which we'll see in a minute, opposite in the gate of crisis is what it's known as, which is the potential to either navigate crisis, but I'm also going to argue it's the potential to create crisis, because everything in human design is kind of seen through this duality of like potential or shadow, and relativity and all that stuff. So you have this potential to either navigate and overcome crisis or to create it. And then you have gate 6, which is the south node, which is the gate of conflict. And that can also be part of the channel of intimacy. So it can be this force to be penetrating and bringing you close with somebody else. But it can also be this thing to like create chaos. And the reason I want to point out these keynotes is because guess who has these as their design sun and earth? Donald Trump, the current president of the United States. So I think you can see that energy operating in a very clear way in how he moves into the world. Then you have the moon. Moon changes gates every 8 hours. So that's why that's kind of got an asterisk, because that's going to shift. And I'm going to actually bring up another picture of the mandala in a minute to show kind of what energy it's going to enter into. But this is currently in the gate of details, overnight. Then you have the gate of extremes, and that's the gate 15, which is also the gate that, which is what Mercury is in, as well as Jupiter. And that's really interesting because I know everybody's so hyped about Jupiter going into Cancer today, and that's its sign of exaltation. But Jupiter in the gate of extremes seems kind of wild, because Jupiter is just this, it can expand whatever it touches, right? So that's really interesting from a perspective of like what kind of extremes could Jupiter be expanding, not to mention Mercury being in this gate of communicating the extremes, but that's fast moving energy. So I think it's going to shift in the next day or so. Then you also have that keynote is also known as like the love of humanity or not. So I think you can also see that playing out as well, of like people doing things for what they care about, very Cancerian, and taking care of each other, their family, their community, their people. And then you also have people who think they're doing the same thing on the opposite side that could be arguing that they're taking care of their community and the safety of the community by quote unquote protecting things. So I think that's really interesting from an extreme, very visible perspective of the two things, the duality, very mercurial, of how you could see this moment in time, specifically in LA or even in Palestine or Israel, right, in Gaza. And then you have Venus, speaking of caring, in the gate of 27. It's the gate of the caretaker. It's a Taurus placement. So then you also again have Venus in this place of her home, but it's this really interesting energy of like protecting the tribe. It's in a tribal or communal channel in human design, which is all about making sure what is brought into the world can be raised and cared for. So I think that's really fascinating. Then you have, because you have that energy being activated of protecting your own and what you think is caring and like your perspective and your worldview. And then you have Mars in the gate of commitment, which is super fascinating because 29 is also known as the gate of like saying yes. It can also be, I think it's the darkening of the light. Don't give me, that could be 36, so ignore that. But 29 is this like, I will do whatever it takes energy. And so to have Mars in that gate, I think is really fascinating for this time. I believe it's a Leo placement. And so Leo, it has this energy as a fire sign of being like regal and courageous and righteous. I guess that might be more of an Aries keynote, but it's really interesting to see that as like, if you think of the fire signs as fighters in all their own ways, like Leo would be the fighter of the heart or the fighter of the ruling fighting class or something. So that's this really interesting potential version of what's happening with Mars from a human design lens. We just talked about Jupiter. Then I want to talk about the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune that's currently happening in early Aries. And that is actually in one of the other gates of love. So 15 is a gate of love as well, in the identity center or the G center. But the 25 is a gate of love, is this like universal love or spiritual love, which is like the love of all things. But all of the gates of love can also be the gates of hate. So I think that's a really interesting energy as well, of like, who or what are you loving? Do you have love for everything, or do you have selective love? I think we're seeing that obviously play out right now as well. Then we have Uranus in the gate of contribution, or the gate of like, it's very much like having a perspective, having an idea, bringing that into the world, and communicating that, because it's in a channel with gate 1. So gate 1 is often the idea, the like yang energy, the starting something or this freshness or new thing, breaking ground and creating something. And 8 is the ability to bring it into the world and communicate that. So again, kind of this really interesting energy that I'll touch on in the greater picture of what I saw in making all these slides. Then you have, again, Saturn and Neptune. I've talked about it as like in Aries is this idea of like, whose reality are you living in anyway? So I think that's super fascinating in their conjunction, because I think we are literally seeing that play out in so many levels of society and news and media and whatever else, community, however you want to put all that. And then finally, in just kind of these 13 placements, we have Pluto in the gate of constriction or the gate of fantasy. So that channel is all about like this, like dreaming new potentials into the world, but it's often this very oppositional energy of like limitation isn't usually the word used for that, but this like pulling back energy of like things not being happening. And it can be also this channel where you have all these dreams, but you have to be careful about having these expectations of how the dreams are going to play out, because it's more about the experience, which is also part of the stream with gate 36. So it's you're doing it for the experience, but you have all these expectations that can kind of lead you astray or lead you to disappointment. So it's this really high and really low energy to be cautious of, or to be aware of, that is out play kind of for the collective now. And then, just a side note, gate 36 has been activated since, I believe, the elections, right before the elections, I think a month or two before the elections in 2024 in America. And so I think that's really interesting from an energetic standpoint of like different elections that happened last year and how things shifted, and then how things have shifted back over this year. And what energy, was influencing people's decision making then. So that's a bigger conversation, but that stream, that 41, 30, 36, I'll show you on here, 41, I don't know if I can touch this. I guess maybe you saw that, 41, 30, going back, 36, 35 is up there. That's the stream of kind of like this experiential stream. And at one point, almost the whole stream was lit up for some significant amount of time. And only, I think last week, everybody had that channel of crisis and the channel of rhythm, which is gate 15 and gate 5. So there's been these really intense energies that we've been living through. Okay, so I'm just going to move on from that. That just kind of paints like a background of like some of these key themes that we're seeing in reality, like play out in 3D, in the charts and in the world. And then we have it here, we have the moon in gate 9, which is up here where this arrow is kind of starting. And then the gates progress to the left, or I guess that is counterclockwise in the mandala, except for obviously the nodes go the opposite way. And so it's really interesting to see, like in the next couple of days, the moon will be in gate 10 on Wednesday afternoon, and I think it's like 3 p.m. ish, and Pacific time, 3 to 4 in that time frame. And gate 10 is all about the gate of behavior. Are you behaving correctly or not? It's the love of the self. But I think it's really interesting from a gate of behavior standpoint of like, are people behaving correctly or not? And who is going to impose that on them? Then you get into gate 58, which is in Capricorn, which is all about like perfection and vitality and having the joy for things is why you do something, but it can also be this very judgmental energy. And then you get into gate 38, which is the gate of the fighter. And then you have the gate of ambition after that. And then you have this gate of the mystery and the inner knowing. And then you have limitation. And then you get into all these Aquarian gates that Pluto is going to be traveling through over the next however long, a significant amount of time. That is these gates of kind of revolution and evolution that are leading the change in the 2027 disruption or change in the chart, the human design chart. But when these gates as a keynote in Aquarius are these like gates of fantasy and dreams, then you have the gate of, 19 is the gate of like, are your needs being met or not? It also is like a high level of sensitivity to others and to what's happening in the world. Then you have 13, which is all about like direction and like, it's in the channel where what stories or secrets are being revealed or not. So that's really interesting. Then you have gate 49, which is like the gate of like revolution essentially. And then you have gate 30, which is part of that channel with 41 of like that fantasy or constriction or disappointment energy. And then you have 55, which is all about provoking the spirit in other people. Like, do you have the spirit of, like spiritually, are we compatible? Do you have the spirit, quote unquote, to meet me on my level or where I'm at? So these are just really intense energies. And then you have the gate of community. anyways, I'm not going to go through the whole damn mandala, but you get the idea that we have some really interesting energies over the next couple of days with what's happening in the world and how the moon is moving through all of this as well, and how that might show up with the chart. So that's all the human design stuff. All right, we just talked about gate 10. Now I want to go into the astrology real fast. The astrology is kind of fascinating. I'm looking at it this way, kind of simplified with just the modern planets. I mean, Black Moon Lilith is on here, but we'll get into that in a minute with the rest of the goddesses. So on this chart, I just want to show and highlight the square in the bottom between the 3rd and the 6th house. Obviously, the houses don't matter because unless we're electing a specific time, the chart's going to move, the houses are going to move. But, this early degree placement in Aries squaring these early degree placements in Cancer, and it's this tug of war between like my way, like very Aries, my perspective, my way, versus these Jupiter mercurial energies of like communicating care and taking care of others and caring about really family or the tribe. So I think that is really interesting as these two cardinal forces that are in tension with each other of like what is beginning now? What energy is coming into the world? Is it the energy, this like fighting face off between, is it this energy of like an imposed version of reality? Or is it this energy of like care and community and family and like ancestral relations? And then you have this other square between Pluto and Venus, which is also really interesting from this like shadow perspective of like technology or systems. And again, Venus with care and like comfort and my care and comfort, and like how those two forces are kind of facing off against each other. I just read about like the Waymo cars getting caught on fire and then getting canceled, and Google no longer launching them. And I think that's like a really interesting like shadow surveillance technology versus again like I'm thinking of Taurus in this sense of like the home and protection and comfort and care. And even though protection may not be quote unquote Taurus per se, it's actually probably more Cancerian. There's this like you came into my home energy with that placement and that square and perspective. And then you have Mars trine Chiron in Aries. And so this is this really interesting thing that came through of like this idea of the wounded warrior. And there were two perspectives on this where it was like these two versions of a story you could tell of like, ICE and the military and the police being made to be the bad guys, the internal wounded warrior, versus and like again Mars being the like warrior of the ruling class in Leo, versus like the wounded warriors that are actually showing up for what they care about in their communities, right? And like people fighting for stuff and not being seen. Very Chiron and Aries, like my individuality doesn't matter. Like it's a core wound of like, what is that word? I can't think of the word right now, but it's this like core, almost like it's both ancestral, but and it's like identity based, but it's like, I'm not an equal human kind of wound that is like unending. I'm just seeing this pit of this wound that so many people who are of the global majority of the global south of our brown skinned people, I think that's this really interesting potential energy that supports different versions or different narratives of the warrior. So that's like really fascinating. Then you have Pluto in conjunct, that's this blue line here, Pluto in conjunct that Jupiter Mercury conjunction in Cancer. And so again, it's this like, again, the shadow side of technology, what is not being seen of how this technology is being used and weaponized. And that might just be a very specific perspective on this. Like there's so many ways to interpret Pluto and Aquarius. But again, against this, like taking care of the family and the community energy and keeping the family and community secure, right? Cancer's about the home and about the crab and having the like protection of the shell. And then you have this energy that's intruding upon that protection. So again, super fascinating kind of face off between all these different dynamics. Okay, and now we bring the goddess in. And so a few things here I want to point out, and I'm going to tie this back into human design in a minute, is we have this T-square that's now illuminated when we bring in Vesta up here in Scorpio. A different time of chart, so, things moved a couple hours later. But Vesta is up here now in Scorpio at the top, T-square with Pluto, down here with Venus. And that's just this really interesting energy of, again, kind of like the home. Vesta colloquially is known as the goddess of the hearth, but I know Vesta as the goddess of the soul, and tending the inner fire of the soul and the priestess kind of position. So you have this like sacred keeper who does the daily work to keep the temple in this T-square with this Pluto as this like plutocracy, right? Can also be wealth. So you have this shadow of like technology and wealth. And again, with this Venus energy of like comfort and care and like, I don't even say luxury, like, it's just like self-worth and like dignity, right? And so you have this really interesting configuration of these two things that are facing off and maybe, could be working together, this sacred rage of like what people care for and care about in T-square with the wealth of the country, or these people who are trying to be the ruling class with that Pluto and Aquarius. And so that's just a really interesting combination of energies of like, what's going to win out, I'm going to leave it at that. I have more questions than answers with this, and I'm more highlighting things to like ping off your own processing and brain, and maybe this will help take things to another level for you of what you're seeing in the world and maybe not naming. Okay, so the next thing I want to name is then we have Mars opposite Pallas, and that's Pallas at the end of Aquarius. And that's really interesting, is these almost siblings, right, of war. And they're in complete opposition to each other. So that was a huge thing that stood out when I brought the asteroids in to highlight this, the goddess asteroids in to highlight what else was going on in these charts. And you'll see there's a whole other dimension to this when we map this on the human design chart as well, where like Pallas is the strategist. She's also was patriarchized, for lack of a better word. I know there's probably a real word for that, but she was masculated as a warrior goddess. There's some, I'm hearing not to bring that up. Anyway, there's different language around who Pallas was before. But now you have her kind of in this face-off. So I think this is really interesting energy of like, again, these tensions of war and conflict all in many layers of these charts, right? And who's right and who's wrong and who says what. And then, Pallas could be power to the people in Aquarius, or it could be power to the system. And Mars could be power to the individual as like Leo and See, or it could be power to the ruler. So you have these wildly different ways of interpreting these things that are very real and playing out in the world right now. The other thing with Pallas is she's in conjunct the South Node. So that makes me think of like, what are we not seeing in terms of strategy or conflict that is old, that is coming into these experiences? Like, it reminds me of different riots that have happened in LA, but it also reminds me of these playbooks that different strategists are enacting to try to control the populace, right? And the different narratives they say about people being unwildly when, like, they don't do this for sporting events, right? So, like, what is really going on here? What's under the surface? What are these other dynamics and factors at play? I don't know if there's anything else on this chart in particular I wanted to point out. There is like some other inconjuncts that I think are really interesting. Like, oh, I guess I did want to show the inconjunct between Juno and Scorpio and the Sun and Gemini. And that's, Juno is the goddess of commitment as well. So then we have that commitment theme again. And it's this really interesting, like, where are your allegiances or what are you committing to? Is it like people or ideals or whatever? And an inconjunct placement is very much like if you put your arms straight out from yourself and you put them far enough back, you can't see both arms at the same time in your peripheral vision. It's like what's hidden or what's in tension that you can't hold together. And so there's something really interesting about that commitment versus like the individual or versus, I don't know if I want to say, I don't know what else I want to say there. I mean, I'm thinking about the Sun in Gemini, and it's like very much like, I guess, different ideas, right? So just something to consider. And Scorpio is this fixed energy where it's like if it's committed, it's super committed, you know? So that's really interesting keynote about that placement. The other reason I was thinking about some of this stuff is because we're going to have the full moon on Wednesday morning, and that's in Sagittarius. And Sagittarius is also this other fire warrior energy, which is all about the pursuit of like capital T truth at all costs. Right? It is this other warrior. It's the warrior of the philosopher, the intellect, the spiritual sage, it does not give a dog a bone. It never lets go. And so it's on that path till the end of time. And I think that's this really interesting energy in the mix now of like, what truth are people pursuing or fighting for with all these other fire placements in the mix in Aries and in Leo. And I guess, I don't know what degree that full moon is going to be, but I don't think it's going to be, I don't know if, I would have to double check that, but it is what it is. But you can also see that it's already making a trine to Ceres, and Ceres is this really interesting energy of the mother who will stop at no cost to protect her daughter. That's the energy of Demeter and the mythology of Demeter and Persephone. So, she'll starve the world until she gets her daughter back. So there's just these really intense energies, or the intense version of the energies is really coming through what I'm seeing in these charts and like literally what's playing out on the world stage, and isn't maybe what people are talking about in the same way, or at least I haven't seen yet, but I also haven't been reading everybody's stuff today. Okay, so the final thing I want to go through is looking at what's happening on the human design chart when we bring in these goddess asteroids and energies, and the other channels that get created actually from all these placements. So if you look at, let's start with the Palest Mars opposition. What's really interesting is I believe that, that puts Pallas in gate 30 from when I double checked. Speaking of details, I had to double check all these, so hopefully they're all right. But when I'm checked, that creates that full channel of that 4130. And in asteroids in human design don't technically activate these energies in the same way, but I think there is this filtering effect with these energies in these channels. So even though the planets aren't there, if you have these activations in your chart, or even just the collective energy that's hovering in these spaces, astrologically, metaphorically, even spatially, whatever, there is this filtering energy of how these things are playing out. So take that as you will when you consider how these activations are created, even though they're not technically created because they're not planets. There is still this filtering effect. And so when you look at that, then you have that whole channel with the 4130 in the bottom of the body graph, the bottom right, that gets created, that would then create some root pressure of can both be what are you fighting for, but it's also this pressure to do something. And then you have the solar plexus that gets activated, which again is this big emotional energy. And that's, again, that really high highs, really low lows kind of energy with that full channel. Then you have in Scorpio, you have Vesta, I believe, in gate 28, which again is this like sacred warrior energy, because 28 is this like both like, what are you struggling? Gate 28 is a gate of struggle. It's also the gate of purpose. So it's like, what are you struggling for? What's worth fighting for? And that whole channel gets created with the 2838. And so that's the channel of struggle, or the channel of the fighter, or the channel of purpose. But you can see that obviously playing out as well. And when that gets activated, that creates the spleen kind of level of like safety, security energy, this primal instinctual energy, which I think can really show up in groups and groupthink. I was once in like a stampede, and it was literally like primal, like no thinking. So it's just wild to kind of like remember we're actually animals, and to be in experiences that remind you of that, and bring those like primordial systems online, or primal systems online. And then you have I believe it's Black Moon Lilith, which is doing this in conjunct thing with Ceres and all that stuff in Aries. But then you have that full channel of transmission. So it's like, it's both transmission, but it's also about seeing people and bringing people together and maximizing talent and communicating things and marketing things. So that's just this really interesting channel of, again, like what stories are being told, or how are things being packaged, or how are people being brought together or utilized in this time, and how are people's talents on display. And I think about that again with like social media and how people are showing up, the signs people are making, like people finding their roles in these big things in the world. Even with the people on the flotilla, you know, you could argue that they're just influencers or influencer activists. That's one way of just seeing them, not saying that. But if you saw them that way, you know, that's the role that they can play, and they are playing that role well, in the sense of like bringing awareness and creating issues with being captured in international waters. That brings a whole other level of attention, right? Like that's the role that they can play, and they are playing that in that conflict. And then you have gate 1, I believe, is where Ceres is. Who is that? Oh, maybe I'm reading these backwards. No, I don't think so. No, I'm not. But that's where I believe Ceres is. I'm going to have to double check that in a minute. But, again, I thought I did this, but here, I'll just check it now. Wrong app. This one. So, this is the synthesis index from like Zen Human Design. So, it's a great tool to be able to look up specific placements. Okay, so 1852 and Ceres is 1847. So it's going to go, it's retrograde anyway. So it's in gate 1. Yes. So it's in the gate of the creative. So now you have this whole energy of like individual creation coming in, and what people are creating and communicating. And you see that again with the creativity and the protests, and like how people are showing up, and the roles they're playing, and what's going on social media and whatever else. And so you have that throat activation and communication, and you have the identity, and that's very activated of like, what are people showing up for, and whose identity is being questioned and violated. And I think you could see that with like the faceless police and ICE officers and military, who you can't even see their identities. Like it's almost erased. It's an identity of an institution versus the individual identities of people out there on the streets, right? So like very interesting ways, again, from a duality or different ways you can see all of these energies showing up. And then when you look at the centers, the last center that I forgot to mention before was like the ego or the willpower is activated here, which is really interesting energy, again, with like who's in control and who's dictating things and who is trying to control the situation. And also it's the heart energy. Both the will and the G are formerly both part of the heart chakra, but the will is now more associated with the heart. So like, where are people's hearts in all of this, right? So fascinating energies to like see in living color what's happening in the world. So I just wanted to provide some perspective. Again, more questions than answers, more things to think about and chew on and consider and make sense of. Like, we live in a time of like great change. And so this is something that I have free resources around if you want support with understanding things. I've talked to the collective record keepers for anyone who's accessing messages for these times. It's a free download where you can receive at least 2 messages. I think another one's coming, TBD on that timing, of talking to the record keepers of how do we navigate what's going on in the world? How do we figure out what's ours to do? And how do we kind of anchor into things? And that's for people who care about the world and are here to play a role in this great collective change. There's like part of my work is about purpose in the time of prophecy, because we are in this time that has been prophesized about this huge change that we're facing. And there's so many different things I could say about that, but I have an article on that called The Tectonic Times that kind of goes into all these different factors that are playing out and how we can kind of recontextualize and understand what's happening and how do we find our way forward. I have a background as both like a futurist and a mystic and a systems kind of science and thinker and person and strategist and all that good stuff. And I bring that together with a lot of like soul work and as an initiated shamanic priestess. So I have this unique lens where I'm always looking at things from a mystical perspective, and I'm also looking at the strategy or systems or data behind things. And so I bring that lens to prophecy as well, because to me, it's like these are just potential forecasts for where we could go or potential warnings down the road. And we get to choose, we get to choose. So this is a time of choice. This is a time of figuring out how we're going to show up. This is a time of alignment. And so having tools like human design or astrology or other soul systems, Anamara is this soul system that brings human design gene keys and astrology and more all together, creates a 4th chart system. That's the work that I do, is to help people find their way forward, to build aligned businesses or creations in this time, to find their role and to do what they're here to do in a time where it's really important on what we're focusing on and what seeds we're planting for what's next. So if you found this helpful, or if you have any questions or comments or other thoughts of things that you're seeing in these charts, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to have you comment below.